On today's World Insight, leaders of the Group of Seven Nations, or G7, including those from the EU, gather in Italy for this year's summit. What are the summit's top priorities? What's on the agenda?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. The summit of Group of Seven Nations, or G7, will take place in Italy this week. The leaders of the seven member states, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the US, together with top EU leaders, are expected to take up the rule-based international order. With the ongoing challenges such as the Ukraine crisis, conflict in Gaza, climate change threats, and the sovereign debt crisis in the global south, could the G7 make a difference and make sure to implement its earlier commitment to all of these issues? That is a question mark. How much will it be torn by geopolitics? That's another question to be answered. Let's loop in our panelists for discussion. I'm joined in Washington, D.C., Klaus Laris, fellow from the Woodrow Wilson Center, and in Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, professor from East China Normal University. In Beijing, Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair Professor, Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Let me start by asking about the G7 this year, later this week. How much do you see that it is going to address the real issues of fragmentation of the world and geopolitics? Professor Wang, briefly.
Well, about G7, actually, not so many focus now as Euro, because many people are disappointed about G7. We focused on G7 because there's election in the European Parliament. There's so-called the anti-subsidies investigation from the European Commission. And also, of course, about the Ukraine crisis and the Middle East crisis. That's the G7. And the overcapacity so-called narrative about China, and about South China Sea and about Taiwan, of course, China's concern.
Professor Mahoney, is this going to be a quote-unquote, what some believe here in China, a Western alliance against the China conference again?
You know, this is certainly something that we have to be concerned about, because what has the G7 really become in recent years, except some sort of Security Council for formerly leading economies in the world that are centered on the U.S. Economy. I think one of the concerns to follow my colleague in Beijing is that we see a really this strange contradiction in this meeting. On the one hand, we see Biden desperately pushing agenda items, but these efforts are grinding to a halt because he's not only distracted by a difficult race, but because the rest of the world is now hedging. What if Trump returns to office? Does the U.S. withdraw again from the Paris Agreement? Does the U.S. reverse course on NATO and drop support for Ukraine? Does Trump spark a global economic crisis that in turn makes China a more valuable trading partner? Trump doesn't like groups like the G7, where power is more diffuse. He prefers being one-on-one, where he's the biggest player in the room and can use that as leverage in bilateral negotiations. At the same time, we have a prime minister in Italy who really wants to make the most of this. She's really feeling flush right now, given the success that her party has encountered with the EU elections. And so we find this strange desire for something to happen, and yet the likelihood that what we'll see is a lot of hedging, maybe some modest steps forward on some issues like AI, but on the whole, as Wang Yiwei said, why are we really concerned about the G7? Because what we saw them do in Japan, which is advance this position on de-risking.
Go to you, Professor Laris. You are based in Washington, D.C. You're watching the European Parliament election, the EU Parliament election recently. What do you think will be the nature of this year's G7?
Well, I'm more optimistic than the other two speakers. The G7 has become quite important in the last few years. Once again, it used to be to be replaced by the G20, but in the last few years we saw that the G7, the importance as a constructive talking shop, has improved. Of course, some of the leaders which will show up in Italy have just been weakened in the European elections. Meloni, who chairs the elections, has actually come out much stronger, but German Chancellor Scholz and French President Macron have clearly been weakened by the parliamentary elections in Europe. And then the British Prime Minister Sunak, he is facing a general election, which he will probably lose. So the G7 will have an awful lot to talk among themselves and how to strengthen the democratic forces in Europe. But they will also deal with Russia, with Ukraine, also economic relations with China in particular, and of course AI and other climate change. All these topics will be discussed. Whether we can expect decisive decisions, that I think is a very different matter, but it will certainly be a constructive talking shops among the Western leaders.
Let's go to some of the specific topics. We understand the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the conference likely to be held in Switzerland later this week. Either China and the UN Secretary General has also made clear that he will not be there. So how interesting is it that this is taking place right before the G7 discussions? How much do you see, without rhetorically speaking, the consensus about what regarding Russia-Ukraine conflict can be reached at the G7?
Well, firstly, the European Parliament elections make the diversification of the powers of the parties. So there are maybe in the future, there are different parties, they have different seats in the European Parliament, European Commission, European Council, and even the so-called the Foreign Affairs and national the security Commonwealth security head. So they are of course influenced with the support of the Ukraine. They are more inward-looking thinking. They are more focused on the domestic economy and welfare, and also they're not so much interested about climate change. So I think maybe limited support of the Ukraine may be more questionable in after election in Europe, and of United States as well, because of the debt, huge debt. Now that the American citizens pay for the interest more than the military budget. So I think it's acceptable for the U.S. support of the Ukraine. So that's make the negotiation maybe in the next year is possible.
Ukraine and Russia will, of course, play a very important role at the G7 discussions. What is particularly on the table is how to provide more money to Ukraine and to make sure that that money is being delivered to Ukraine without the interference of the US Congress or any other national parliament who may not wish that money to be passed. And they're talking about taking interest rates from the Russian assets, which have been seized in Belgium, and provide money, these interest rates, and we are talking about something like $50 billion to Ukraine. That will be on the table, that will be discussed, and I'm pretty sure that some model of how to do that will be found so that Ukraine will be better funded in the future, independent of the return of Donald Trump or the return of a right-wing government after the French elections in France. And that is the intention, to Trump-proof or to Le Pen-proof the money for Ukraine.
Professor Mahoney, we see the very different beliefs, or at least the approaches on the surface about how to deal with the Russian-Ukraine conflict in the issue like the peace conference. So how do you see from that piece of news to the discussion likely at G7 summit about the Russia-Ukraine issue?
Well, again, I think one of the things that we've seen throughout the Biden administration is this desire to try to put in place various strategic structures. Klaus said to make them Trump-proof or Le Pen-proof. Because the U.S. is very much aware now that as it moves from one administration to the next, that we see this sort of radical changing in terms of strategic objectives and policies. Although I think there's a lot more continuity than we sometimes admit. Nevertheless, I think again the real problem with the peace conference, if we can indeed call it that, given the absences, is everyone seems rather clear that there's not going to be any real progress made on this until after November, that the current occupant of the White House is very heavily invested in this position that he's taken in Ukraine. And as a result, we can't really optimistically talk about a real peace or a post-war solution until that election has taken place and we know his future and what sort of position he might take or that his successor might take.
How do we see the green transformation that we all subscribe to likely to be articulated as a result of political changes? For example, this time at the EU parliamentary election, the Green parties throughout Europe are not necessarily gaining impressive seats, and also the phenomenon that geopolitical concerns might be overwhelming for the green transformation consensus reached earlier, for example, reflected at the issue of EV. Professor Mahoney.
Well, it's a compelling question, and it's probably the most important question in my current research. My concern is that that we've seen countries like the United States and perhaps Russia playing a strategic endgame with climate change. We had hoped that when Biden came back, when Biden won office and rejoined the Paris Agreement, that we would see the United States taking a clear leadership position on this issue globally. But instead, we saw Biden consolidating America's position as a leading oil producer by expanding oil production in Alaska. We haven't seen much progress at all, and certainly very little progress in terms of cooperation with China on this issue. While we do see this remaining a very compelling concern in Europe, and certainly during the very difficult days in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where they faced a tremendous cost plus inflation related to energy. This was something that they were all very much worried about. But increasingly, my sense is that the global North is realizing that they have a strategic advantage over the global South, that there's an advantage that they have in so much as climate change is more damaging to the South than it is to the North. At least this is what I think they're thinking about in Moscow and Washington. And I think, unfortunately, Europe is being drawn down this path because climate change is being pushed aside by securitization concerns and with things like the conflict in Ukraine, but also Gaza and the growing specter that the U.S. has created with regard to China.
Yeah, I wouldn't entirely agree. I think climate change policies and the Green Deal is pushed aside above all by domestic politics. And we see the success of the far right in many countries in Europe, but also the success of Trump and his supporters in the United States. They have several reasons why they are so popular. One of the reasons is immigration and the state of the economy, but another reason is the Green Deal, that many of their voters and supporters say the Green Deal has gone too far. We cannot just introduce these EV vehicles overnight. For example, we have to calm down the Green Deal. And I think politicians, including President Biden, but also Chancellor Scholz and Macron, they all are listening to their voters and say, indeed, we seem to have gone too far. That means this is very bad for the climate and for protection of climate change policies, but it seems to be the answer to push back against the success of the far right in Europe and also in the United States. Perhaps after the election in November, that will change again, but I'm not that optimistic.
The earlier tariffs by the United States against the China-produced electronic vehicles to as far as 100% tariff has created great concern about international trade rules. For example, conflicts needs to be resolved at the WTO, and this time not. And also about the U.S. Commitment to green transformation, in which transportation is a big chunk of it. And talking about transportation, electronic vehicles could be one of the major solutions as earlier planned. So, Professor Lauwers, given all these problems related to that decision, how articulative do you think Washington could be during the G7 summit about its decision and putting pressure on the others to make similar decisions?
In practice, as said, regarding the United States, that 100% tariff was not that important. What the EU is doing, the investigation into EV vehicles coming from China, the investigation whether they have been unfairly subsidized, is much more important, because it would mean that a flood of EV vehicles might arrive in Europe, which would be good for the climate, but would be perhaps bad for European producers of EV vehicles. And once again, we see that the economy and domestic politics is winning out over climate policies. But from a European point of view, this is perfectly understandable. From a Chinese point of view, this is, of course, not understandable at all and difficult to understand.
I'm not sure whether there is really a so-called united European point of view. As far as I'm reading from the trade associations, from different industries, particularly the car makers, some of the major car makers, president, CEO, chairman, have all spoken out. They say, please do not do it. Otherwise, we are going to do something that we don't want, both in our own market and in others' market. So that's very interesting, how the debate is shaping up and how rhetorics about the debates are shaping up.
I agree with you that Europe is polarized in that question, including, for example, Germany and German car makers who have their doubts about the investigation. But many countries in Europe, including the EU Commission, are pushing that forward. And climate change is really not featuring here at all, but it is domestic and economic concerns. From a European or from an EU Commission point of view, understandable. From a climate point of view and from a Chinese point of view, much more difficult to understand.
I'm not sure even that is understandable. Professor Wang, there was earlier the so-called principle of comparative advantage being advocated in the green transformation by some of the European politicians. And now we are seeing more rhetorics about so-called green justice or environmental justice, meaning if our jobs is being taken away, no matter how many jobs that we're talking about, and then there's no justice. But the question really is, the green transformation is exactly about that. It's about the green industries taking the place of the fossil fuel industries gradually, and sometimes gradually and according to our plan. 2030, 2050, 2030, 2060, for example, in different countries. So how do you see the U.S. could be articulative in its discussion with its European counterparts at the G7 summit about this?
Freedom and justice, it's a different scenario. When you feel confidence about the future, when you're strong, you talk about liberty and freedom. When you are not self-confident about the future and the current situation, you talk about justice, like trade and green. So the so-called e-vehicles of the Chinese comparative advantage actually is comprehensive. It's not just subsidies. Actually, Europeans, US, they're all substitute to the new the carbon industries, but not such like the 60% more than produced in China. For instance, China's electricity price is only 1/3 of the France and 1/4 of the Germany. And the Chinese government provide very strong and comprehensive the logistical support for the like infrastructures for the e-vehicles. And also Chinese people, they too much want to take the new technology. The Europeans, they are aging society, they are more conservative. So this is actually they cannot face up. This is a new reality that China in modern times that catch up with the West, even take the leading role in the e-vehicles.
You run into the question of comparative advantage. If a country is capable of producing a competitive product at a much cheaper price, then it's reasonable, if we're operating under a market economy, that people would want to buy that cheaper product. And I think that's certainly the case with solar panels. Now, with EVs, I think what we have to first of all ask is whether or not this story of overcapacity is really true. This is the narrative that the United States has been driving, but we haven't seen any empirical data or any empirical studies validating this. Furthermore, if it does exist, I think it's a gift to the rest of the world. And if anything, it's an economic threat to China. In fact, what we see is that from what we think, again, we don't have a lot of data on this point, is that there may be a lot of local governments who are pushing forward in China with developing EV industries. But this is probably excessive. This is probably risking some type of bubble. It's not likely that all of these companies or firms are going to end up producing products that would be competitive, that would meet international standards, that would even be able to survive in the Chinese market. Now, we do have market leaders in China, and those companies have been competing according to international standards. And indeed, other international companies like Tesla have been competing on a relatively level playing field in China with those companies. In fact, it's become a case study. So I think the question is, does overcapacity really exist? Why has the United States driven this narrative in Europe? The other side of this point, though, is that we do see a number of European countries willing to take Chinese EV factories into their own countries. In other words, we don't necessarily want to buy Chinese EV products that were made in China, but if they're made in Hungary or Spain or France or Italy, that may be something that is much more palatable. And indeed, that might be the way that this issue is ultimately resolved, given what we see happening at the EU level, but also at the national level.
Having said that, though, this is an interesting question as to how the G7, particularly the United States among the G7, will be able to articulate its decisions, which are questionable, and whether the rest of the G7 would accept the pressure coming from the US as it is and follow suit. That has become such a big question mark in everyone's mind. Professor Lauritz, your thoughts on this, particularly for this year's G7?
The EV vehicle policy of the Europeans are driven by the EU Commission. They are behind it. And they have their own fears of that flood of Chinese EV vehicles, which they foresee. I'm not saying it will happen, but they fear it may happen. And that is the reason why they have investigated that subsidy culture in China regarding EV vehicles. How the G7 is going to discuss this, I don't know, of course. That will be contentious. As I said before, the Germans are not convinced that investigation into EV vehicles makes a lot of sense, and they are very critical of that, and they will possibly clash with the other leaders around the table. But I don't think that the G7 will in a major way deal with that problem at all. I think Russia and Ukraine will dominate much more the discussion than any EV vehicle discussion.
How persuasive can Washington be this time at the G7? Professor Mahoney?
Well, I think the issue all goes back to the November election. Clearly, Europe has moved very much in the direction of the United States. I agree with Klaus that Europe has its own concerns, that it has its own issues. But the G7 also includes Japan and Canada, who have, I would argue, much more closely hewed to the Washington line than their European counterparts. So I think that the problem in Europe is that we see countries like France very much concerned with the growing power in the EU of the Eastern European or Central and Eastern European countries like Poland, which have a much more close relationship with the United States and which are not part of the G7 as individual nations, but belong to this broader EU paradigm that one in which the French see their position at risk. So clearly, I think the U.S. has a considerable amount of leverage, but that leverage is tempered.
Well, in today's world, it's more and more difficult to build the consensus and make the consistent policies and coherent our actions. So actually, not just about the current crisis. Actually, this G7 meeting also focus on the November, another very important event, the UN Future Summit, where revives of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, which China actually take a leading role in reaching these goals and ahead of time, 10 years of the limited poverty. But the Western powers now forget of the responsibility, either in the technology transfer to deal with climate change and also to deal with the hunger, with the violence, with all this, the youth and the women's rights. So now I think China play a more important role in this regard.
With that, we're coming to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for all your input and your insights. You might have very different views, but that makes a discussion. Really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.